Hi, I'm Suzanne Ehlers, and this is Not Really Strangers, the podcast where we explore just how connected the refugee experience is to our everyday lives and to the social issues that matter most to us. Thanks for joining us for another conversation with a brand new guest, here to share the story of how they came to realize that their story and the refugee story were intertwined. By the end of this episode, you'll see that in this global community, the distance between us is often much shorter than we think. Let's dive in. Here we are with my name twin, spelled the same way with a Z and two N's, Suzanne Barakat. I'm so happy to have you on the Not Really Strangers podcast. Welcome.
It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's the irony of the name, Not Really Strangers, and our name twins. There's so much to unpack there.
There is. And as a doctor, thank you for making time. I have some small sense of how demanding your schedule is. And this conversation, I know, was important enough to you that you carved out space for us. Just an appreciation for the profession that you're in and the demands that it puts on you, and still wanting to storytell and wanting to connect with listeners is really important to me. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I think storytelling is a really important part of the work. And moving hearts to change policies. And a big part of that is narrative and narrative telling.
Tell us where you're calling in from today.
I'm in the Bay Area in Oakland, California today.
Okay. And maybe it's the same place, maybe it's not. Where do you call home?
Oh, what a complicated question to ask a global citizen. I was born and raised in North Carolina, and in many ways that is home. And then I came out to the Bay Area for residency. That's been home for over the last decade. But growing up, we used to spend a quarter of the year, our summers, in Syria. And I spent 2 years of high school living in Syria, going to my mom's all-girls public high school in Arabic. And so I remember even as a kid feeling like the airplane was this time capsule that would take me to a different place, a different time, different people, different lived experiences, and then plop back into a very different reality. So it gave me, from an early age, just what it meant to be from different places all at once.
And all those places can be home in different ways.
I got to the name of your podcast, Not Really Strangers. I think it was in those years that I really sat and wrestled with how, as an American-born U.S. citizen, I myself had perceptions of people from other places in the world, including where my parents had come from, and assumptions about their humanity or about their needs or desires. And to have lived and sat on classroom benches next to them, and to have seen firsthand their lived experiences and their struggles and their emotional kind of roller coasters that they would go through, and to realize as a child, as an adolescent, they are just as human as me, was, I think, the most formative takeaway that I made growing up, that has really shaped, how I live my life now and the work that I do. And so in a lot of ways, I think while it was a very risky thing, and I don't recommend parents plucking their kids in the middle of high school and taking them to a foreign country with a different language, it ended up actually being a defining chapter in my life.
You started to tell this story, and I know more than my listeners do about your career and your important work, but will you talk to us a little bit about when and where forced displacement and refugees became something so central and so important to you?
So having lived for 2 years in high school in little town Idlib, Syria, where everyone knows everyone, family members were all within walking distance of one another, I came back during college and did public health work and tuberculosis, working with orphans locally. And it was just the place that I kept coming back and wanting to give back and work. And then as the crisis started unfolding, my own family became displaced. And I watched live, via WhatsApp and videos and conversations as they, over the years, had to flee on foot. And became displaced all over the world, where now even when multiple family members are in Germany, they're still hours apart by train. Yeah. And even with the fall of the regime that's been over a year now, many of them have not come back because there's a lot of there's not a lot of certainty, economic, educational, social kind of opportunities that would compel them to leave what is a little more comfortable right now, which can tell you just how unfortunate the Syrian kind of crisis has been, that people who can technically still come back still have not chosen to come back.
Yeah.
And to have gone from being in this little social bubble where the family got together every couple days, we all lived on the same street, to then being displaced all over the world. I kept coming back, in undergrad and medical school and residency, working on the Syria-Turkey border, providing first humanitarian relief and medical work, working at a polyclinic, treating children with shrapnel injuries with no access to antibiotics, treating pregnant women with no access to pregnancy care, and working in the emergency room in Gaziantep, being the only Arabic-speaking provider, seeing, brain matter on gurneys from people getting shot. I mean, it was so severely traumatic. And I kept coming back and feeling like, this was just a drop in the bucket, but whatever I can do was still meaningful to that one patient. And I had some trauma happen with my family in North Carolina that by the time I went back after that, I had to kind of mitigate my trauma exposure, given my own personal experiences, that I was like, you know what, let me deliver babies, because that's a happier thing. And I worked in the Gaziantep state hospitals, also as the only Arabic-speaking physician. And it was also very traumatic. There were 14, 15-year-old girls who, the alternative was get raped in Aleppo or get killed. And so these girls had been married off to Syrian boys in Turkey and no access to any kind of prenatal care or abortion care. And I was delivering babies to 14 and 15-year-olds. And it was and continues to be dark and heavy. A lot of my training at UCSF was in family and community medicine, and my niche is refugee and asylee health. And this was just a natural kind of woven into kind of my DNA of how I ended up in doing this.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for what you do, but also for, your candor and courage, and sharing with the listeners like how that journey has shaped you, and also being very clear about the trauma that you've experienced, not only in your own family, but on the front lines of providing care in such a circumstance. I mean, there's so many things that you just said that jump out at me, but I have this image of what you said of, on the street and the family getting together on a regular basis. And then the next thing you know, your family is displaced to sort of all corners of the globe. And I just want the listener to sit with that, right? Wherever you are, maybe you're in Arkansas, my family's in South Texas, and Sundays is when they get together and somebody makes a big pot of something and they sit in the backyard, like stuff that you take completely for granted. What if overnight, every one of those family members is like thrown to the globe, and you don't have the chance to be in community together anymore? The stuff that you take for granted, you're no longer like jostling at the table together, asking people to pass the dish. I want us to sit with that. Is the face of displacement, is no longer having that proximity and that like physical intimacy and the sharing of food and the kind of occupying of space together. So many stories of displacement are at the heart of that. And I'm so sorry that is what your family has experienced.
Thank you. I think you're also touching on a point of privilege that, I sit in a bubble of privilege in the Bay Area in the US, and I feel like my life is of these two extremes, and I have a hard time reconciling them. And with it comes this enormous sense of responsibility towards not just my extended family, but to everyone who has been displaced beyond their control. I grieve that all of our childhood photos are in our home in Syria, our childhood home, and I can't access them. They're gone. I have no childhood photos of myself or my sibling that has passed away. to share with my children and pass on those memories. But who am I to complain when people have lost everything? Their homes, their families, their livelihoods, their futures, entire generations lost, uneducated, trauma that has not yet been unpacked, and what that intergenerational trauma will look like and the impact it will have, not on just them and their lineages, but the world at large.
Yeah.
And we have never seen the amount of displacement in the world that we see today. And this expands beyond the context of Syria. But, at one point, Syria was the largest refugee crisis our world has ever seen.
Yeah.
But for the most part, Syria has been forgotten. I visited Syria 6 weeks after the fall of the regime, and I was in Damascus. And while the city itself has not been as damaged as other places because Assad lived there, there was an employee from the White Helmets that kind of broke protocol and took me in his car, in his little van. And he wanted me to bear witness to the town of Ghouta that had seen some of the worst chemical warfare that our history has seen. And the entire city, we were driving for minutes on end on a highway, and all you could see was destruction, blown out windows and doors, rubble to the ground. This is where he was from. I filmed minutes on end, and I would stop, and he was like, Doctora, shufi, look, bear witness to what has happened because no one gives a damn. And it was just even having another human shoulder with him in that moment, that I bear witness the suffering that you have gone through, is important and valuable. And his humanity, seeing that someone is caring enough and that's all it takes to just hold someone through their suffering.
I want to make sure our listeners know that the civil war, the devastation in Syria, stretched on for the better part of a decade, 12 years, almost 14 years, would you say? And that the fall of the regime, it would have been in the fall of 2024 that you were there, then shortly thereafter that. And then when I had lunch with you, Suzanne, I shared with you that I had been in November of 2025, sort of just short of the 1-year anniversary, and had been in Damascus and had visited some of the suburbs, had seen some of the devastation that you've just described, and talking with families who, the insecurity in going back, people don't want to go back because they don't know where healthcare will be. People don't want to go back because they don't know where their kids will go to school. People don't want to go back because they fear that the violence and the conflict will continue because their houses have been bombed out. They have literally nowhere to live. So these are like the really practical concerns, but they're profound practical concerns. So I think there's this sometimes misunderstanding why, when it's peaceful again, why don't people go right back? You've made your life. In this instance, people have made their lives and built their families for 10 plus years in a refugee camp or a settlement. These are not ideal circumstances, but they have more there than they know they might have going back to. And I, like you, was so, exactly how you describe it, minutes on end of your phone's camera with just burned out, blown out building after the other. And you think, how will we ever do justice to the Syrian community and help them rebuild when there are stories of like such courage and resilience in people who want to make a better tomorrow, particularly the young people, which I know you also have interacted with. Also, if you could just talk a little bit, because you said it on 2 or 3 different occasions, the only Arabic-speaking provider in multiple circumstances. What does it mean to come seek urgent healthcare and have one doctor who can interpret and translate for you? Like the demands on you from coming at every angle. Like just talk a little bit about, how exhausting that must be, but also how empowering to be the one that can do the interpretation.
I was sitting in the laboring room where there would be 4 to 5 laboring women sharing one bed at a time in an open room. So you have like maybe 20 laboring women at one time. And as she is crowning, she is instructed to walk over to a delivery station with the stirrups, where oftentimes unanesthetized, unconsented episiotomies are performed. There's a language barrier and no one is speaking to them in a way that they understand. and they're traumatized. This is not patient-centered care. And babies are delivered sometimes with complications, and there's no one to assess the baby until 24 hours after birth. And I had to run around and, there were hip dysplasias and complications that I alone can't do. And the girls who would tell me, they would pray for me in between contractions. And the irony that they would ask me if I was old enough to be a doctor when I was literally twice their age. And they would ask me if I had children, and they would make dua and prayer for me. And afterwards, to come and visit me one day postpartum and just to say, thank you for treating us with the dignity that no one has treated us with. They have treated dogs on the street better than they treat us. And this was a repeated sentiment. When I was working in a makeshift clinic, I had a woman who was 7 months pregnant come in preterm labor. And I had assessed her. I was still a medical student at the time. I didn't fully know what I was doing, but the cervical exam, I was like, there's some dilation. I can't tell you exactly how much at the time, but she is going to deliver. And it was an experience just trying to convince her, please, you need to go into the hospital so you can get some steroids to help the lung maturity, to help this baby give them a chance. And she was like, I'm so tired of being treated like trash. I would rather lose this baby than be treated this way. And I sat with her in the ambulance, hand-delivered her to the hospital, gave my sign out in my broken, English to Turkish, with all these language barriers. And she came and saw me the next day and thanked me so much for treating her again she asked me, where are you from? You're treating me with this compassion and this dignity that I have not seen. And that is such a sad sentiment and a sad statement that so many people who don't have access to healthcare, don't have access to clean water, are in tarps without access to birth control or abortion care or antibiotics, repeatedly feel like they're treated like trash. My assessment of how we have failed other human beings that share our earth, regardless of where they come from, is otherization. When we otherize a group of people, we rip them of their humanity.
Yep.
When we rip them of their humanity, you can justify anything against them, including violence, including a genocide and an eradication of entire people.
Mm-hmm.
And when you come and actually meet these children, these women, these elderly, these men, and you see that, you know what? They want the same healthcare we do. They want the same successful, happy, healthy marriages that we want. They have crushes too, even in war. They need clean water. They want good futures for their children.
Yeah.
We are all the same in that, no matter where we are in the world. And I struggle to comprehend why we keep repeating history's mistakes and allowing the evil and powerful to rip the humanity of the masses.
Mm-hmm. That comment that you make about othering, I think is so fundamental. And of course, we've seen this throughout history. But as soon as you count someone else as less than or as non-human, everything and anything is justified. And the treatment of those who have been othered with, sort of lack of care, lack of compassion, lack of dignity, I actually think it's fundamental to sort of understanding what you're up against, because otherwise it can't make sense to you. You can't put your head around it until you realize that, it really is lifting this story of shared humanity. I mean, it's so fundamental. It's like what we're taught in kindergarten, and yet it doesn't penetrate for some. So I just really, the next question I have, you've answered it already in so many different ways, but I never want to presume. So I'm going to ask it because maybe there's some last piece you want to put there. But I think of your journey professionally. I think of what you've shared with us about your journey personally. And is there sort of one overarching message that you want our listeners to hear? Something you wish they knew or understood better?
as cliche as it sounds, I think that we're really all more the same than we are different. And while it's a known tidbit, I think that we can all say, oh, yeah, I believe that. I think that the struggle then becomes reconciling within ourselves our own implicit biases that we carry subconsciously and
Mm-hmm.
aren't aware that we have, that then allow us to apply this otherization for another group of people.
Mm-hmm.
Because if everyone actually reconciled within themselves what their biases were, our world would be a much better place, standing up
Yeah.
for the rights of every human being to be treated with dignity, to right of life, to all the human rights that we all deserve.
Right.
And I think the issue is the disconnect between, I still believe that most humanity and most people are actually all good. But our blind spots, our biases,
Mm-hmm.
and then our cowardice to actually have the moral courage to face an injustice and to say, to lean into the discomfort of our privilege and say, what is my responsibility to
Mm-hmm.
ensure that others are not facing this and that I can uplift them as well? That's where the disconnect is.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that reflection. I mean, that there's the potential is in each of us, and it really is about having the courage almost to sort of reveal or admit to our own bias, our own shortcomings. You touched on this just now, actually earlier in the episode. The theme or the name of the podcast is Not Really Strangers. And I would love for you to riff a little bit on this idea of being a stranger. What is it like? What does it mean to you? What does it mean in the world right now? I think of your TED Talk. I think of so many pieces of your work and writing that I've seen. Where's stranger for you?
This is a loaded question for me because it brings up personal trauma that I've yet to share on this podcast, and it's that in 2015, my brother and sisters-in-law were executed in their Chapel Hill, North Carolina home by a white supremacist neighbor who didn't like that they were Muslim while they were eating dinner. And unbeknownst to the rest of the family, he had been harassing them repeatedly, including brandishing his gun and threatening them. And my sister-in-law's mother and parents had advised her, like, just get to know him. Right now he's a stranger. As you get to know him and he gets to know you, he'll know you for who you really are and will turn around. He's your neighbor, right? There has been this shouldered burden and responsibility as Muslims in this country to represent, the second largest faith in the world. And it's exhausting when you're only ever seen in the lens of a national security threat. And here they were, my brother was a dental student at UNC. He had just married Yusur, who was about to join him at UNC Dental. They had just come back from their honeymoon. They'd been married for only 6 weeks. And this neighbor comes in, and it was caught on film by my brother's cell phone, and he proceeded to execute them. Sorry, I never know how to talk about this. It's been 11 years, but this is my defining trauma. And in my mind, growing up, it was always be kind, smile, turn them from strangers to friends with your warmth, with your compassion. I was a medical student rotating all throughout, the small pockets of North Carolina, even rural parts. And there would be patients who would refuse to shake my hand, who would refuse my care altogether because I wore a hijab and I was visibly Muslim. And it was like this challenge to bring them to the other side and help them see who you really are. And instead it was the exhausting, like, oh, you're the exception and not the norm, when actually I was quite the ordinary Muslim American. And it was just this exhausting burden that up until my brother was murdered, it was smile and, convince them you're not evil or a threat, right? When my brother and sisters-in-law were murdered, it changed the narrative into, no, I have to speak up and I have to fight back this narrative that was stolen from us. And even in trial, we, my last parting words to my brother and sister-in-law's murderers was, how would this day have been different for you and for all of us if instead you had knocked on their door and joined them for dinner instead and had gotten to know them? There was a documentary called 36 Seconds, Portrait of a Hate Crime, that's available that follows the story and captures parts of this conversation. And I'd been told by people later, like, how profound it was to, how would it have been different if this person who had otherized your family had actually joined them for dinner, and it doesn't matter what it was, like it could be a glass of water, to see them for their humanity.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot. And I think our world would be a much healthier, safer, more inclusive place that can allow for children and adults alike to thrive if we had actually focused on that humanity.
Yeah. Suzanne, I can't see, of course, our listeners. I can see you. And I knew this story. And of course, I've listened to your TED Talk. We'll put everything in the show notes. I didn't know whether you would share on the podcast today. I thank you. And for an answer to a question that I've asked so many times to so many people, I don't think an answer has ever moved me quite as much. I'm in honor of your family and that loss and that trauma, this distance between us, and how much we can make of it, how much we can multiply it, how much we can, amplify it unnecessarily. And then the option that we have, in fact, to bridge it, right? I mean, I would love to just sort of think about that opportunity to what would have been different if in that moment to come in and join at the table. And I also appreciate too, though, that, when I first asked the question, you reminded us that, I mean, as a woman, how many times are many of us told to just be nice and to make friends and to make eye contact and to make other people feel at ease. And I will tell you that for me, the narrative is, that's how you bridge the gap. And of course, in this pursuit of shared humanity, we will continue to do that because it's the courageous and morally right thing to do. But I also appreciate that you've reminded us that there's a cost in that to many people, that there is, that you put yourself in a position of danger often, that there are real consequences to being the one who is always building the bridge, or at least trying to dismantle the mischaracterizations and the false narratives that surround. So I think for the first time since I've been asking that question, I'm reminded, I guess, of just the toll, the personal toll that creating the bridge can cost.
It ended up actually also shifting my work clinically. I had been going to the border numerous times, doing the humanitarian relief work, the classic doctor thing of save each patient, help them in any way you can, but feeling incredibly limited by how this was a drop in the bucket and not doing anything towards accountability and justice for these people. And after I experienced a number of violent, senseless losses, I shifted a little bit of my work into forensic medicine work, so documentation of torture and ill treatment to assist asylum seekers and refugees, asylum seekers in gaining asylum in the U.S., and also training Syrian physicians in Turkey on the documentation of torture that was then used with the ICC and the ICJ to prosecute war criminals. When I was in Syria, 6 weeks after the fall, back in February of 2025, one of the things I did was meet with a number of stakeholders between the government, international organizations, local CSOs, impacted families, to help shape what does a national forensic response look like for Syria as it pertains to missing people and mass graves. In a way that it, as you had alluded earlier, ensure that this is Syria-led but globally supported. And
Mm-hmm.
that's an element that's often missed, I think, in the space of international org leadership, where we will often come in thinking we are the experts, but lacking sometimes the very important cultural, on-the-ground context and nuance that is the difference between epic failure or success.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we combine and bring in and leverage local expertise, amplifying their dignity and humanity and their experience in and using best practices learned from other global contexts around the world to allow for a successful transition. And the realization that truly there's no peace for these people without justice and an acknowledgement about what that happened. And justice can look in different ways, whether it's legal, or even if it's narrative, or it's bearing witness, or it's the storytelling, to help people feel seen, and that just an acknowledgement. What happened was not okay. Before we can just move on and think it's just about, it's not just the healthcare and the schools and the social opportunities, but it's, do you acknowledge what happened to me that was so unjust and so wrong, and what's going to happen with that? And you can't untether the two.
It makes me think, I mean, what a beautiful reminder. I think of organizations, just because organizations speak is often, we're data informed and we're evidence based. And then you can think of, a refugee led experience or something like this national forensics response that's rooted in local knowledge, that too is data informed. That too is evidence based. It's beginning in a space of lived and shared experience. My last question, and I'm going to say, if this is a question that you don't want to answer, I'm okay with that, because the story that you've just told of the murder of your brother and your sisters-in-law is around a dinner table, and the last question I ask is about breaking bread together, and it's about a shared experience. And so I want to invite you to set that table for us. I want you to tell us what you would put at that ideal, sort of shared dinner with family from wherever, all over the world. Sourcing's not a question. Chef is not a question. If that's a table that you can imagine with us, I'd be honored, but I'm also respectful if it's not.
My mind does go to the dinner table that my brother and sisters-in-law were murdered at. It's seared into my memory, the photos from the forensics and seeing in court the unfinished meals that I am stuck with, feeling like, what if you had just joined them for dinner? It's similar to the sentiment. It's not about what you said, but how you made me feel. I think the dinner table is less about what is served, but the warmth and the compassion that is sensed at the dinner table.
Yeah.
And I think if you were to ask me how to shape it, one of my key takeaways with entering into more leadership spaces is always who is not at the table and needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I try and lead in shaping these tables with that question, because it's easy to exclude the voices that are most important to be at the table. And having been a member of minority groups that is often on the menu and is targeted and attacked, I find that it is of utmost importance to center the voices of those most impacted, because they are the ones closest to the solutions that are right.
Yeah.
And it's less about the exact makeup, but just ensuring that in whatever goal you're trying to create with the setup or the table you're trying to create, you're always asking who's not at the table and needs to be. When I was in residency at UCSF at San Francisco General Hospital, it's basically a safety net hospital that only accepts underinsured or uninsured patients. So predominantly unhoused or substance use or psychiatric illnesses, a lot of comorbidities. I mean, it was my people. It was like my favorite place. And I learned so much about what it meant to be human. And it was during that training that my brother and sisters-in-law were murdered, and I had to come back to work to 80-hour work weeks of a very heavy trauma focused place. And it became almost like a challenge for me to get out of bed was one goal, if I can do that post-trauma. And then it was, if I could turn one patient from being lying on their bed, looking down, not making eye contact with me, to looking up and smiling and having them feel that they were treated with dignity and respect, then that makes my day. Because that is treating someone how I would want to be treated, how my brother and sisters-in-law would have wanted to be treated. And it was this little game that I kind of had with myself that gave me a sense of meaning and purpose.
Yeah.
And I'd sometimes kind of look down at the from lower myself beneath them, meet their eye contact until I see the smile and be like, got it. And it becomes this thing that you bond over. It can be so small, but so meaningful. And you see their disposition just light up. And I realized in those interactions that actually a lot of our Black patients in San Francisco, many of them were Muslim. Because they would greet me with assalamu alaikum, and they'd ask if I was Muslim, and they were kind of out of community. And we created what was called this like SF Muslim Fellowship, where we literally brought people together from that I'd meet in the hospital, often without a phone. We'd give them flyers, and we'd just meet together and have a meal and have them sit together to just share whatever came to their hearts. And we had a local spiritual leader come and kind of lead them in this, whatever conversation came up. And it was over a meal. I don't even remember what exactly, but it was something that brought them together and made them feel pursued and desired and that they mattered.
Yeah.
And that was priceless.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a beautiful story. A beautiful story to end on. I think that we can be overwhelmed by all of the change that's needed. And I always say what a privilege it is to do work like you do and work like I do, that's sort of chipping away at some of the world's most vexing problems. And yet you have to be content with sometimes making change only one person at a time. Not everything is upstream. Not everything is population level. Sometimes it really is getting yourself out of bed in the morning and having one patient who sees themselves differently because you saw them differently. And so that is a beautiful story on which to end. I'm going to express enormous gratitude on behalf of all of our listeners for the courage and for the honesty and for all that you shared with us today. To my named twin and now my forever friend, Suzanne, thank you for coming on. Dr. Barakat, thank you for coming on Not Really Strangers.
Thank you so much for having me, Suzanne. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks so much for listening. Your time is valuable, and it means a lot that you've chosen to spend it here. You can find today's show notes, including how to connect with today's guest, at unrefugees.org/notreallystrangers. That's unrefugees.org/notreallystrangers. While you're there, I hope you'll consider making a donation to the organization I lead, USA for UNHCR, to help us provide more support for refugees here in the US and around the world. If this episode was impactful, please take a moment to review the show and share the episode with a friend or family member. This small action will help us have a much bigger impact. Thanks so much. Don't be a stranger.